Welcome to Madang Podcast. Today's special guest is Diarmuid O'Murchu, who is a member of the Sacred Heart Missionary Order. In this episode, he shares about the divine spirit, Aristotle, soul, incarnation, AI, climate crisis, and his new book, Divine Radiance in Human Evolution. Please stay tuned. We live in a time of crisis upon crisis, and yet the church is silent. The need, or better put, the demand for a new trajectory of faith is clear. Where do we begin? Is there a starting point for considering faith beyond Christendom? Please join Homebrewed Christianity's new online class, Rise of Bonhoeffer, Faith, Resistance, and Theology in Action. This class is hosted by Drs. Tripp Fuller and Jeffrey Pugh, with a list of top experts on Bonhoeffer. This important class is donation-based, including free. So please go to www.homebrewedchristianity.com to register today. This episode is sponsored by Orbis Books. Orbis publishes award-winning books for the church, school, and society. Please visit www.orbisbooks.com and check out all their books, and please do sign up for their monthly newsletter to get all the updates on books, authors, and events.
For sponsorship inquiries, please email madangpodcast@gmail.com. This is Madang, an outdoor living room for guests to share their experiences and their work. I invite you to come in and stay for a while.
Welcome to Madang Podcast. Today's special guest is Diarmuid O'Murchu, who is a member of the Sacred Heart Missionary Order and a graduate of Trinity College, Ireland, and is a social psychologist. He has worked as a workshop leader and group facilitator, conducting programs on adult faith development across several countries. Now, as a retired missionary, he lives in Dublin. He is with us today to talk about his forthcoming book, Divine Radiance in Human Evolution, published by Orbis Books. We are so excited to have you with us, Diarmuid, today.
Thank you.
So I know that with the time difference, thank you so much for joining us.
You're welcome.
Yes, and we kind of crossed paths just on the web because many years ago, you've published so many books in your lifetime, and I was able to endorse one of your books.
Yes, and I'm very grateful for that. In the beginning was the Spirit. That was
Yes,
the one.
yes,
Mhm.
and it was an exciting book, an excellent book, and I hope people will go out and read that. And so that was kind of my first encounter with you. And so years later, thank you so much for coming on my podcast, Madang Podcast.
Thank you. Glad
Yeah.
to be here.
Oh, thank you. So your book will be coming out later this spring, and it's called Divine Radiance and Human Evolution. I think most of your books are published by Orbis Books.
That's correct. Yes.
Yeah. So this is now another excellent book by Orbis Books. And so tell us how you began writing the book.
Well, I have had a long interest in human evolution ever since being a student many years ago when I began reading Teilhard de Chardin. Even though Teilhard talks about evolution on the big global scale, I very quickly began moving in the direction of looking at the story of human evolution. And when I began doing that back in the 1970s, the dates for our human origins, which kind of blew my mind, were 2 million years. Since then, the figure has been extended to 7 million years. And so I have found myself for many years now saying, why doesn't theology, religion, and spirituality really take that date seriously? Because if you're to ask the question, what is God's dating for our world? It's 13.8 billion years. What is God's dating for our human story? It's 7 million years. Whereas, of course, the former religions, as we all know, are dated at about 3 to 3,500 years. So it was the desire on my part and obviously an invitation to all people doing theology and involved in spirituality, that we really do need to look seriously at that long story, which is God's story for us and with us, and begin to readjust and reevaluate and reconsider our theology and spirituality in the light of that long date. And eventually, I've got around to writing the book specifically on that topic.
Yeah, I think actually, I don't know if you've read Ilia Delio's books. Um,
Yes.
yeah, so I find your book should be read together with hers, and those who are reading her book should follow up and read your book because I thought it kind of goes hand in hand because she's also dealing with similar topic and the whole idea of evolution, etc. So I thought it was a very interesting read.
Uh-huh. Yeah.
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 So in the book, you do talk about divine spirit. And for me, the spirit is everything because I do so much work on the spirit, and the book I endorsed you was on the spirit. So share us a little bit because you use the title divine spirit. I just use spirit most of the time, or I
Mhm.
use the Asian concept of chi. So tell us because you talk so much about this divine spirit, and you said it still continues to renew the face of the earth. We reawakening within the human spirit and organic evolutionary wisdom too long suppressed and denied. And I thought that is just fantastic wording there.
Yeah. Well, a foundational premise on which I'm working throughout the book. The major world religions, all of them, and
Mhm.
particularly the monotheistic religions,
Uh-huh.
work with a premise or an assumption that the human being, the human person, is fundamentally flawed, that there's a deficiency, that there's a weakness in us. And therefore, all the religions then postulate themselves as having the answer to that foundational problem.
Uh-huh.
When we look at the long evolutionary story, a major challenge facing us is that in actual fact, it would seem from the growing body of evidence being produced by science that we as a species got it right most of the time. We did not get it wrong, which is the assumption of the religions.
Uh-huh.
What's the evidence for that? The evidence is kind of twofold. Number one, that as a species for most of our time on Earth, and of course, very much more explicit evidence coming from the hunter-gatherer stage, which goes back to at least 100,000 years, is that we remain very close to the Earth and very close to nature. And when we humans do that, we seem to get it right.
Uh-huh.
Secondly, we are a species with a long history of an enormous potential for creativity. Creativity is actually our default position. And the evidence for that today is particularly looking at ancient stonework, which is now, we can date it back and trace it back to 3.3 million years ago.
Wow.
Taking those two strands, it seems to me now, to some extent, I'm making a deduction here, but it's a kind of a fairly logical one from those 2 points, is that our ancient ancestors detected a sacredness at work in creation. They didn't call it God. I'm not entirely sure what they called it, but certainly looking at the approach to creation that we find among indigenous peoples across our world today, it seems to me a reasonable, logical step to say that their understanding of God was something akin to what our First Nations peoples call the Great Spirit.
Uh-huh.
That for them, the living energy of creation, the foundation of their creativity, what motivated and inspired them to remain very close to the earth and very close to nature, is that they detected a profound sacredness at work in all that. And that sacredness I name as spirit, very much following the line of our indigenous peoples around the world in their notion of the Great Spirit.
Yeah, so, as you're speaking, so many thoughts are going through my head. I do teach at Earlham an interfaith dialogue course. And, we go over some of the major world religions. We also cover indigenous spirituality and animism and shamanism. So,
Yeah.
as you're speaking about this and talking about the spirit that our ancestors talked about. So is it the same spirit then that
Yes,
we're
it is. And
okay?
the short the short answer is yes. And when the anthropologists and the
Uh,
scientists talk about animism,
uh-huh,
you see, they tend to dismiss it as something primitive, as
uh-huh,
something barbaric, as something that's not solidly founded.
uh-huh,
The whole thrust of animism is
uh-huh,
the sacredness that our ancient ancestors detected.
uh-huh,
And just we name it more as animism, that everything has a soul. I because the notion of soul is a relatively recent one in the history of the world religions. It's
uh-huh.
very much a notion developed by the classical Greeks, Plato, Aristotle, and so forth. If we
Well,
go back further into time, we're talking about spirit, not soul as we understand it in the mainline religions today, which is very much an idea of an interventionist God giving us something extra to make us holy and sacred. That's not how our ancient ancestors approached life. But then they gleaned, they experienced the sacredness coming in and through their deep affiliation with the natural world.
so as humans evolved, do you think we kind of got it a bit wrong as we evolved then?
Now, one can only answer that question, I think, in terms of our more recent development. And
Uh,
as yet, we don't have the evidence to go back into deep time, so to speak. I'm
uh-huh,
sure we got it wrong quite a number of times along the way, but also I think because of this close affiliation with the Earth, we managed to get it right again. The
uh,
time we're now living through which we have got it wrong, we're
uh-huh,
living in a period of about 12,000 years. Now, people coming from the former religions, when they hear a figure like that, they would say, this is bombastic, this is ridiculous, because we're so kind of indoctrinated into time spans of 2,000 years or 3,000 years, or at most 5,000 years. So
uh-huh.
12,000 years ago was what's known as the agricultural revolution, which in fact is not really a good naming for the event at all, because we have been involved with the land and the potential of the land for quite a long time. This event of 12,000 years ago was where we began to organize our use of the land in a much more structured way, in a way that began the movement of domination and control and so forth, leading in due course to what today we call a system of patriarchy with hierarchy and control and so forth, leading to the evolution of kings about 6,000 or 7,000 years ago, and eventually down into the formal religions themselves. So, in other words, we began to get it wrong when we started treating the land as a commodity to
Okay.
dominate and control. That's where we began to get it.
Oh, that's so good to hear because I have a new book coming out with Orbis this year called Earthbound, and that's talking about climate change and the commodification of the earth and whatever is on the earth. So I think your book and Ilya's book and maybe my book could be all read together in conjunction with,
Absolutely.
yeah. So as you're speaking, it's so fascinating. You're talking about the different time periods and our little minds or my little mind, I can only go back 2000 years of, with Christianity.
Yeah.
In the book, you bring in other religions. So you were speaking in the book about adopting a kind of Buddhist transparency. So if you can say a little bit about world religions, interfaith, and this Buddhist transparency and what that means for us, of those in the Christian faith tradition.
Yes, for us in the Christian faith tradition, and this would also apply to the monotheistic religions, there's a preoccupation with hierarchy.
Yeah.
There's a preoccupation with domination and control. There's a very strong sense of a ruling, governing God from on high. And maybe worth pointing out here, as the beginning of responding to your question, the wisdom, sorry, the wisdom that some theologians are looking at today. When we look at the book of Genesis, the early part of it, this idea of the Father, dominant creator God, creating ex nihilo. Now, as you and many theologians will know, that tells us nothing about creation. The ex nihilo is that before this Father, Creator God, there was nothing. There could have been nothing, because this God is totally in control. I very much like the work of Catherine Keller, and I'm sure you're familiar with it, where she says we really need to revisit that entire way of understanding things. And of course, Face of the Deep, which she published in 2003, is all devoted really to the first two verses of the book of Genesis, of chapter 1, in which she says, instead of ex nihilo, we should be looking at ex profundus, the spirit that draws forth creative energy from the chaos and the vitality of creation at large, from the profound depths. Now, to my mind, the other world religions touch into that somewhat more explicitly, I think, than the monotheistic religions do. Taoism, for example, just to take one example, is a religion that has a much greater sense of the sacredness of the earth and the sacredness of creation. The Buddhist transparency, what I mean by that is that Buddhism emphasizes more the interiority. And as we're more grounded interiorly, we're likely to be more in touch with the living spirit. And therefore the emphasis on meditation, reflection, and so forth. Hinduism, for me, is very much a religion of celebration. And it's a pity that aspects of Hinduism today, even in India itself, are moving in the direction of the monotheistic approach. I think that's a rather sad betrayal of the religion itself. So the other great world religions captivate something of that diversity, of that deeper meaning, of the focus on interiority, rather than being over preoccupied with getting the external power right.
Oh, that's very interesting. So thank you for sharing that. Earlier, you did mention Plato, and in the book, you talk a lot about Aristotle. You mentioned that the human person is essentially autonomous, or that's what he says, separate, ensouled, and rational.
Yeah.
So how are you using Aristotle or not using Aristotle and the understanding of the soul? So share that, because I think the understanding of the soul is important. You kind of mentioned it briefly earlier too, but I think that is something that my students are always curious about every time I mention the spirit. So if you can say a little bit about, the philosophy that influenced Christianity and continues to do so, especially Western ideas, thoughts, and philosophy, and this understanding of the soul.
Yes, I can remember as a young person, I'm going back now over 50 years ago, somebody, I think it might have been a school teacher, explaining to us that at some stage in the growth and development of the child, of the baby in the mother's womb, God sends an angel down from heaven to inject a soul into it. And from there on, it becomes a living person. Now, I have never heard a theologian or anybody in the field of catechetics or spirituality say that. But that kind of belief, I think, is much more widespread than we actually think. And then, of course, we put a lot of emphasis in our Christian faith and very much in the Catholic tradition that I come from, that at the end of life, the soul escapes from this limited prison of the body to the fullness of eternal life hereafter. And the spiritual life with which I was brought up in my early years, that the whole purpose of the spiritual life is to prepare us to live in such a way that we are preparing for that ultimate moment when the living principle, which is the soul, can escape from this prison to the fullness of life hereafter. I don't find that meaningful anymore. And therefore, I'm quite explicitly now saying these days, we need to replace the word soul with the word spirit. We're all creatures of spirit. Spirit is, and I'm drawing very much here on quantum physics, spirit, everything in creation is made up of energy. What energizes the energy? Living spirit is the answer, it seems to me. And therefore, that spirit which constitutes the life of each one of us, and therefore the story of each one of us, actually begins with the desire or intention, however expressed or not expressed, by our parents to procreate, or maybe more accurately, co-create the conditions for new life. It's almost like our parents working consciously at some level with that energy of the living spirit, out of which each one of us is born. Therefore, the little phrase, the baby coming into the world, in my opinion, is completely wrong. We're all born out of God's creation, out of that energy of the Spirit, which is forever seeking to create. And therefore, I would like to see us moving away from the concept of soul, even though I know it is very sanctioned and used extensively still, not just in Christianity, but in all the religions, and replace it with the word spirit.
Okay. Actually, that would be very helpful. I wish my students will now be listening to this podcast interview because that's very helpful. It's something that many Christians are struggling with. And, for me, the spirit has always been the energy, the life-giving spirit, the chi that is in all matter. So thank you for that explanation. To continue on just
You're
a little
welcome.
bit about Aristotle, you wrote that he was primarily concerned with males. So females were dismissed as misbegotten males, an unfortunate demonization that Aquinas adopted some 1200 years later. So this is a huge problem within Christianity and also some of the major world religions.
Indeed, yes.
Yeah, misogyny, patriarchy, sexism. So what are we going to do about this because of this influence with these male thinkers, Aquinas, and majority of the theologians within our Christian history? What do we do about this female problem or the problem that is brought on?
One way I'd like to begin approaching that, I think as people become more acquainted with the insights of modern science, whether it's cosmology, whether it's chemistry, whether it's biology, whether it's evolutionary theory in my case, or paleontology, the study of human origins, we begin to see that life is much more complex than we often take for granted. And that in actual fact, for much of our time on the earth, we didn't have that kind of streamlining which set the male over the female and saw the male, because that dominance of the male, again, it seems to me, is very much a product and a remnant of the post-agricultural time. That domination, that control of the land and so forth. And as we begin to realize that that's a limited, narrow way of looking at life, and that even our own story is much bigger than it, hopefully we come to beginning to understand and appreciate that the egalitarian approach, which involves both male and female, is in fact the healthier one and the one that's more likely to lead us to a deeper truth. What, on a more specific level, I guess re-education is going to be hugely important here. And how that can be brought in to our schools, to our universities, to our seminaries, and maybe those of us involved in the fields of spirituality and theology have a particular responsibility for highlighting the fact that God works creatively more with an egalitarian approach to all life, including the human species, right down through history. That's how I would try to approach it.
Well, thank you. I hope people approach it in that same way. So let's hope that people will read your book and figure out how to get rid of this because it continues to be a big problem, and with politics also involved, reinforces the misogyny that is kind of underlying many of the world religions and, of course, Christianity. In the book, you mentioned about in Africa, the notion of Ubuntu. I am because we are. And that's an important phrase for the Africans, and many liberation theologians have adopted it. So, how are we supposed to live like this, by this, or understand this phrase, especially in the West where we are so individualistic and that is the main focus? And we kind of want to perpetuate that within the church and Christianity.
Yeah. Well, again, I think it's the last point where I ended, that in a sense, as a species, I think we're more programmed to be egalitarian relational beings rather than ones that are over preoccupied with our isolated individual identity. The expansion of the Ubuntu phrase, which many years ago I got from the great Desmond Tutu, I am at all times the sum of my relationships. And that's what defines my identity. And when you think of it, even at the biological level, our coming into the world of each one of us, we come in through relational energies, mediated through our parents. Who we become throughout the journey of life very much depends on our relationships. And I think increasingly we have to emphasize not merely our relationships with other human persons, but our relationships with the natural world as well, and all the different beings and organisms in it. So we are programmed for relationality. And I'm told, and I haven't had a chance to investigate this too much, that brain science today is actually beginning to affirm this same kind of insight. That actually the human brain, in the light of the emerging way of understanding the brain as a hologram, for example, indicates that the brain itself is programmed primarily for things to connect, interconnect, and relate, rather than these different individual centers in different parts of the brain, which is what we have more emphasized in the past. And then that would then give us the opportunity to revisit our theology and begin to realize that the doctrine of the Trinity is not that philosophical, epistemological struggle that many of us had about how do you fit the three into one, but that it reflects a time in our past in which our ancestors were basically saying, whatever else our God is about a deep capacity for relating, which in time got translated into a doctrine. And interestingly, you find versions, as you probably know, of the doctrine of the Trinity in all the major world religions. So, our God would be one of a relational reality. And therefore, relationality becomes that we all have to come to terms. Many years ago, I had the privilege of meeting and doing some work with Desmond Tutu in South Africa. And it was from him that I got the explanation of the Ubuntu, that concept which I believe originates with the Bantu tribe in Africa. And Desmond's explanation for it was, I am at all times the sum of my relationships, and that's what confers my identity. In other words, I don't get my identity really from being an isolated, autonomous individual, which is more the understanding of the human person, again, that we have inherited from classical Greek philosophy. So this relational understanding of the human person is a one that would also help us to connect more meaningfully with our great ancient ancestors, who I think operated primarily out of that more relational matrix. Then when we revisit our theology and we look at something like the doctrine of the Trinity, I think if you were to ask our ancient ancestors, what is their understanding of this reality we call God? One of the answers they quite likely would have given you, whatever else God is about a deep capacity for relating. And then that experiential sense over a number of years got translated into the doctrine of the Trinity. And I find it quite interesting. There is a version of the doctrine of the Trinity, one version or another, in all the major world religions. But instead of being preoccupied with the doctrine, I think we need to get behind or beneath the doctrine and see the experiential dimension, which is about the deep inner conviction that relationality, interconnectedness, interdependence is our default position, if you like.
Oh, that's a fascinating explanation. So thank you for sharing that. In your book, you touch on Christology, and I think Christianity is very Christocentric. But you begin by saying that the incarnation of God in the life and ministry of the historical Jesus did not begin with Jesus of Nazareth. It began 7 million years ago in East Africa. So if you want to say a bit more about that, I'm sure people in the church may get a little uptight about this, but I found it very interesting. So share with us what you mean that it began 7 million years ago in East Africa.
I'm beginning really there with St. Paul. I can't remember the exact text. When Paul says, when God says yes, God means yes. And at every moment in the large history of the evolution of our planet, the creativity of the Divine One, of the Holy One, is there in every major emergence. Therefore, it seems to me that the God who was fully with us, the God saying the full yes to this new species now evolving in life, 7 million years ago in East Africa, was not looking down the timeline and saying, well, I'm going to create these new creatures now called humans, but then I'll wait for about 7 million years until Jesus of Nazareth, my beloved son, comes along, and then we'll declare them saved. To my mind, that just doesn't make any sense. And I think anybody with basic intelligence would begin to realize it doesn't make sense. Therefore, that then begs the question, how then do we understand Jesus? Who is Jesus for us today? And I use three very key, I think are very key words in the book, that then we can now begin to revisit the Jesus story and begin to realize that Jesus is about an affirmation, confirmation, and celebration of everything we achieved over the 7 million years, because we got it right most of the time. Affirmation, confirmation, celebration. The real disturbing bit about that, which you very rightly remarked on, contrary then to the traditional view that Jesus came to rescue us. No, Jesus didn't come to rescue us from anything, because there's nothing to rescue us from. We got it right most of the time. Now, then, when we look at the primary program, what I think is the primary program of our Christian faith, beautifully expressed in the Sermon on the Mount, seek first the new reign of God, and all else will follow. The new reign of God is a kind of a reconstruction of our lives in our world today, pointing us towards an ongoing course of evolution. And so in a sense, I see the story of Jesus and of our Christian faith as a bridge celebrating what we have achieved and pointing us forward to that fuller sense of the evolving spirit. And so I don't feel I'm in any way watering down our Christian faith. I'm certainly challenging the traditional understandings of it. But for me, this brings the Christian story alive in a whole new and beautiful way.
So is the Christ less important than the Spirit? Or how do you understand then the Trinitarian view of the Christian faith?
Well, here I follow Marcus Borg, and I'm sure you are very familiar with his work. And right through his life, very often he explained the Jesus story, that Jesus was a spirit-filled person. If you like, for us as Christians, Jesus, if you like, is a primary embodiment of how the Spirit works in creation.
Yeah.
I think the bit where you run into some problems in terms of the Trinity is, where does the Father figure fit in then? I think that's the bit that gets problematic.
Well, let's get a little bit into that, because in the book you write about our desire to personalize God, ironically risks depersonalizing God. So
Yes.
share with us a little bit. Maybe that connects with the Father God understanding too.
Well, yes, because this energy of the Spirit. So Paul says it's in the power of the Spirit that Jesus is raised from the dead. The general understanding and the story of the baptism of Jesus is the Spirit that leads Jesus along the way. So Jesus himself needs to be understood as being responsive at all times to the call of the Spirit. Although in the overall picture of the Christian faith, we're told the Spirit really doesn't come in but that's not an event in which the Spirit has primacy right through. Therefore, whatever this Father figure is doing, the Father figure's ability to create is only possible in and under the guidance and power of the Spirit. And hence the title of my book, "In the beginning was the Spirit." And so I then I write about this actually in that other book that you referenced and that you supported me in. In the beginning was the Spirit. That maybe at a more meaningful level, if we were to call, instead of calling God the Father the Creator, we use the language of the great birther, the one who gives birth. Embodies that's forever going on in creation. And I'd like to link that in with a great insight from Meister Eckhart, in which he asks, what does God do all day long? And to which he responds, God lies in a maternity bed giving birth all day long. You see, if we had adopted that metaphor in theology, God the great birther, instead of God the great ruler, we'd have a very different theology today, and a much more meaningful one, I think.
Oh, yeah. I think if we moved away from the patriarchal image, like the ruler, king, prince, I think, yeah, our theology and our Christianity would be so different. And Susan Shaw and I,
Absolutely.
yeah, in our latest book, Surviving God, when we're dealing with sexual abuse, I think that has been a huge damage that patriarchal Christianity wanted to focus on the kingly, princely, the master, the powerful, almighty image rather than the birthing image or the God of breasts, as in El Shaddai and other feminine images. I think our Christianity would have been different, and even how we practice and worship and live out our faith would be so different. So thank you for sharing that.
Indeed.
Yeah. In your book, something that I'm not familiar with at all, and I always shy away from, is the topic of artificial intelligence. But you brought it into your book, and you tied it in with AI and the evolutionary human. So because I lack any knowledge about it and I get afraid to study about a bit about it, can you share us a little bit from your book what that is?
Yes, well, we live in a world of mass information. We've been told that for the past 20 or 30 years. And there's no doubt about it. We are moving in the direction. Brian Swim has been writing about this quite recently, of the creation of a kind of a collective mind. And to my knowledge, as I understand it, that idea of a collective mind and touching into the energy of mind, that's maybe a more psychological way of naming the energy of spirit. And so I think technology, can contribute to that and has contributed to it in a very significant way. Now, there are these people they're basically speculating, and that's all they're doing in a sense, that a day is likely to come in which the machine will become more intelligent than the human person. Well, firstly, if that day ever does come, it can only happen because we allow it to happen. And there are some people in the world, the Elon Musks and such people, that that I think believe it can happen. I think the chances of it happening are very slim, because no matter how powerful computers and computer wisdom can be, at the end of the day, it's technical, it's algorithms, it's mechanics really of putting words and phrases and things together. It lacks imagination, creativity, the power of intuition. These distinctive features, you can't really, it seems to me, build them into a machine. A machine of its very nature has to work more with the externals.
Okay.
So from that point of view, I think it's very real. I think it can enhance and support the development of this collective mind, which I would see as a dimension of the spirit power. And the bit we do need to look at, and governments around the world need to look at it, who will control this information and who will manage this information, and what will be the ethical and moral guidelines they'll be using. That needs to happen, and important conversations around it needs to happen now and for the foreseeable future.
Thank you for that. Thank you so much for that. I think that's so important for us to think about, and with the power of Elon Musk, what we should be aware of. In the book, you also touched touch on climate justice and climate issues, what is happening,
Yes.
what we are doing to the earth, which is something that is one of the most important issues of our time. So, as we wrap up this interview, if you could share in your own research and how that relates to this human evolution and divine radiance, what is happening and why are we doing this, and what is our future?
I think there are two factors here that require, I think, a great deal of discernment on our part as a species. The first one is that when we look back over the evolution of life in general, including human life, um, shifts in climate or in weather conditions were always a major triggering factor. So there is a side to climate change that I don't think we'll ever fully control. And when we look back historically, it sure did destruction and damage, but in the long term, it reaped benefits for us and for the entire Earth. So severe weather patterns have an interesting kind of complex history, again, a paradoxical history. A lot of the problems of the present time, where things are being kind of driven out of control, I think it's back to what I spoke about earlier in our session, that we are treating the earth and the resources of the earth as commodities. We're looking at the entire earth as a usufruct that's there for our use and benefit, for us to make money out of. Our ancient ancestors, it seems to me, for the greater part of their time, they looked on the earth as a living organism with which they worked and collaborated. That's the bit we have lost. And I think that's the bit that has us now in very deep trouble. Now, how do we return to that and get some sense of developing that more organic sense of relationship with the living earth and with the living creation? It's a whole new program of re-education at every level of life, it seems to me.
Do we have to do a different way of thinking theologically in and about God for us to stop this climate destruction that we're part of at this moment?
Yes, would be the short answer. And again, I think it's what we've been talking about earlier on. So many Christians still have this notion of the hierarchical God and the God who rules or governs from outside or from above. That how we treat the earth, in a sense, is also how we treat God, if you see what I mean. Understanding God as living spirit who is the source of all energy. Indeed, yes, that spiritual approach today can be seen to have huge ecological, environmental, political, and economic benefits.
Yeah, actually, thank you so much for sharing that. I think those are the words of wisdom that we all need to hear, whether we're Christians or people of other faith, because, we all need to work together to save the earth and to view
Sure.
God as this living organism and as spirit actually is a very helpful way. So thank you, Diarmuid, for coming on Madang Podcast, which is hosted by the Christian Century, to talk about your new book, Divine Radiance and Human Evolution, published by Orbis Books. We appreciate your time, your wisdom, and all the research that you've been doing for decades now, that is found in this new book. And I hope many of the listeners will go out and read Divine Radiance and Human Evolution.
Thank you very much, Grace. Thank you.
Thank you so much for coming on. We live in a time of crisis upon crisis, and yet the church is silent. The need, or better put, the demand for a new trajectory of faith is clear. Where do we begin? Is there a starting point for considering faith beyond Christendom? Please join Homebrewed Christianity's new online class, Rise of Bonhoeffer, Faith, Resistance, and Theology in Action. This class is hosted by Drs. Trip Fuller and Jeffrey Pugh, with a list of top experts on Bonhoeffer. This important class is donation-based, including free. So please go to www.homebrewedchristianity.com to register today. This episode is sponsored by Orbis Books. Orbis publishes award-winning books for the church, school, and society. Please visit www.orbisbooks.com and check out all their books, and please do sign up for their monthly newsletter to get all the updates on books, authors, and events.
For sponsorship inquiries, please email madangpodcast.gmail.com.